I don't care what that piece of paper says. You don't belong in my seat." These were the words that echoed through the first-class cabin of Flight 447, forever changing the life of a 12-year-old boy and exposing a woman's racist beliefs to the entire world. Landon had never experienced anything like this before. He looked down at his boarding pass, then back up at the angry woman, his voice barely above a whisper, as he said, "Ma'am, this is my seat. I have my boarding pass right here." But Alice Henderson wasn't listening. She rolled her eyes dismissively and waved her hand as if swatting away his words like annoying flies. Alice's voice carried throughout the first-class section as she declared, "Do you have any idea who I am? I demand to speak to whoever's in charge of this flight." Her tone suggested that she believed she was the victim in this situation, that somehow this young black boy sitting in a premium seat was the problem that needed to be solved. A flight attendant named Sarah quickly approached with concern etched across her face, having heard the disturbance from the galley. She had worked for the airline for over 8 years and had seen difficult passengers before. But something about this situation felt different, more volatile, more dangerous. Little did Alice know that her demand to speak to someone in charge would soon reveal a truth so shocking that it would not only end her tirade, but destroy her entire life as she knew it. Because the person truly in charge of this flight, this airline, and everything Alice Henderson thought she understood about power and privilege was about to be revealed in the most unexpected way possible. If you believe in justice, type justice and tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and if you want to see justice served in the most satisfying way possible, make sure to subscribe, because this story is about to get intense. What Alice Henderson didn't realize was that young Landon Mark wasn't just any passenger. And this wasn't just any seat, and the man she was about to meet would change everything she thought she knew about who really belonged in first class. To understand how this shocking confrontation unfolded, we need to go back to earlier that morning when 12-year-old Landon Mark was carefully folding his clothes into his small suitcase, his hands shaking slightly with excitement and nerves. This wasn't just any trip for Landon. It was his very first solo flight, and he was traveling all the way to Chicago to visit his beloved grandmother for her 80th birthday. Landon had spent weeks preparing for this moment, reading about airplane safety procedures and watching YouTube videos about what to expect during his first flight alone. His father, Ted Mark, had noticed his son's anxiety and sat him down for what would become one of the most important conversations of Landon's young life. Ted placed his hand on his son's shoulder and said, "Remember, son, how people treat you says more about them than about you." These words would prove to be prophetic in ways that neither father nor son could have imagined. Ted had always taught Landon to carry himself with dignity, to be polite and respectful to everyone he met, and to never let anyone make him feel lesser because of who he was. What made this trip even more special for Landon was that his father had surprised him with a first-class ticket. The boy had stared at the boarding pass in amazement, running his finger over the first-class designation and marveling at his assigned window seat, 2A. He had never flown first class before, and the thought of experiencing luxury travel filled him with pride and anticipation. When Ted dropped Landon off at the airport that morning, he wished desperately that he could accompany his son, but urgent business meetings had made it impossible for him to travel. As he watched Landon walk through the terminal doors with his backpack and boarding pass in hand, Ted felt both proud of his son's maturity and slightly worried about sending him into the world alone. But Landon wasn't the only passenger making their way through the airport that morning. Alice Henderson had arrived with an entirely different energy, one that would set the stage for the dramatic confrontation that was about to unfold. From the moment Alice stepped into the airport, her sense of entitlement was on full display. She cut in front of families in the security line, tapping her foot impatiently and sighing loudly when the process didn't move at her preferred speed. When a young airport employee politely asked to see her boarding pass, Alice responded with condescending remarks about the employee's competence and made it clear that she believed such interactions were beneath her. Alice had always assumed that her appearance, her confidence, and her loud demands would get her whatever she wanted. She had built her entire adult life around the belief that she deserved preferential treatment, and she had rarely been challenged on this assumption. As she made her way toward the gate, Alice was already mentally preparing to upgrade herself to first class, convinced that her charm and persistence would secure her a better seat. When Alice finally boarded the plane and made her way to the first-class section, nothing could have prepared her for what she saw. There, sitting calmly in what she considered to be one of the best seats on the aircraft, was a young black boy reading a book and looking out the window with obvious excitement. The sight of Landon in seat 2A triggered something ugly and automatic in Alice's mind. Her shock quickly transformed into indignation, and she immediately decided that this situation needed to be corrected. In her worldview, there was simply no way that this child belonged in first class, and she was going to make sure everyone understood that. As the confrontation began, Alice refused to even look at her own boarding pass, convinced that there had been some sort of mistake that had placed this boy in her rightful seat. Her language became increasingly coded and cruel as she suggested that Landon would be more comfortable in the back of the plane. Flight attendant Sarah approached the situation professionally, requesting to see both boarding passes to resolve what she hoped would be a simple seating confusion. But when Sarah confirmed that Landon's first-class ticket was completely legitimate, Alice's reaction was nothing short of incredulous. "Who paid for this?" Alice demanded, her voice carrying throughout the cabin. "This has to be some charity program." Her words cut through Landon like knives, and for the first time since the confrontation began, the young boy felt his confidence wavering. The excitement he had felt about his first solo flight was rapidly being replaced by embarrassment and confusion. Other passengers began taking notice of the escalating situation. Some looked on with obvious disapproval at Alice's behavior, while others seemed uncomfortable with the tension but unsure of how to intervene. A few passengers began recording the confrontation on their phones, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Alice's demands became increasingly aggressive as she insisted to the flight attendant, "You need to fix this situation right now." In her mind, this situation wasn't her own inappropriate behavior, but rather the presence of a black child in first class. The systematic nature of Alice's discrimination became more apparent with each passing moment. She assumed that Landon must be traveling on someone else's ticket, insisted that there had been a computer error, and began questioning the boy's family background and his right to be in first class. Her every word revealed deeply held racist beliefs about who belonged in premium spaces and who deserved luxury treatment. Flight attendant Sarah maintained her professional composure, but her patience was clearly being tested as Alice's behavior became more outrageous. Alice began making threats about her connections and influence, warning that heads would roll if this situation wasn't resolved in her favor. Through it all, Landon maintained the quiet dignity that his father had taught him. Even as Alice's hostility intensified and other passengers stared, the young boy held onto his boarding pass and his composure, drawing strength from his father's words about how people's treatment of others revealed their true character. Hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will completely shock you. Alice's demands to speak to someone in charge are about to backfire in the most spectacular way imaginable. And I want to know, what would you have done if you witnessed this kind of discrimination happening right in front of you? Let me know in the comments. Little did Alice know that her insistence on involving higher authorities would soon reveal a truth so devastating that it would not only end her tirade, but transform her from the aggressor into the most humiliated passenger in aviation history. What happened next would completely flip the script on Alice Henderson's racist tirade, and it all started when flight attendant Sarah decided to take a closer look at Alice's boarding pass. Sarah had been patient and professional throughout this entire ordeal, but she was beginning to suspect that something wasn't adding up with Alice's story. As Sarah examined the boarding pass that Alice had been clutching so tightly, her eyes widened in disbelief. The seat assignment clearly read 23C, Not in first class, not even in business class, but in economy seating toward the back of the aircraft. Sarah looked up at Alice with a mixture of confusion and growing frustration. "Ma'am," Sarah said carefully, "your seat assignment is 23C in economy class." Alice's reaction was nothing short of explosive. "That's impossible," she shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that made several passengers visibly wince. "I always fly first class. There has to be some mistake." Her face turned red with indignation as she snatched the boarding pass back from Sarah's hands, staring at it as if her intense gaze could somehow change the printed seat assignment. But the truth was even more damning than a simple booking error. As the situation unfolded, it became clear that Alice had deliberately booked an economy seat to save money, fully expecting that she could manipulate and intimidate her way into a first-class upgrade once she boarded the plane. Her entire plan had been built around the assumption that her sense of entitlement and aggressive demands would get her whatever she wanted. Alice's accusations flew fast and furious. She blamed the airline for making an error with her reservation, insisted that her frequent flyer status should automatically qualify her for an upgrade, and demanded that someone fix this obvious mistake immediately. But with each passing moment, it became increasingly clear to everyone around her that Alice was the one who had made the mistake, a massive error in judgment that was about to cost her far more than she could have ever imagined. When Sarah politely but firmly explained that Alice needed to move to her assigned seat in economy, Alice's response was defiant and shocking. "I'm not moving anywhere," she declared. "I demand to speak to the captain or someone with real authority who can actually solve this problem." Young Landon watched this entire exchange with quiet fascination. Despite his young age, he could see the hypocrisy in Alice's behavior with crystal clarity. Here was a woman who had spent the last several minutes questioning his right to sit in first class, while she herself had no legitimate claim to any first-class seat at all. The irony wasn't lost on the 12-year-old, though he maintained his composure and continued to observe in respectful silence. As word of the confrontation spread through the cabin, passenger sentiment began to shift dramatically in Landon's favor. Other travelers who had initially been uncomfortable with the conflict now saw Alice for what she truly was, a manipulative woman trying to steal someone else's seat while hiding behind racist assumptions and fake outrage. Sensing that the situation was spiraling out of her control, Alice launched into her most desperate tactics yet. She began loudly proclaiming her status as a frequent flyer and VIP customer, though she couldn't produce any evidence to support these claims. She threatened to report the airline to corporate headquarters, promised that heads would roll for this treatment, and demanded compensation for the discrimination she was experiencing. Most disturbing of all, Alice began attempting to rally other passengers to her side, making increasingly obvious racial undertones in her appeals. She spoke about standards and appropriate passengers and the way things should be, using coded language that made her prejudiced beliefs crystal clear to everyone within earshot. But Landon Mark wasn't intimidated. Drawing on the strength and dignity his father had instilled in him, the young boy calmly but firmly stated his intention to keep his legitimately purchased seat. His quiet confidence in the face of Alice's hysteria created a stark contrast that made her behavior appear even more outrageous and unreasonable. The situation had reached a boiling point, and flight attendant Sarah knew she needed backup. She pressed the call button that would summon Captain Salvador to the cabin, knowing that this confrontation required the highest level of authority on the aircraft to resolve. When Captain Salvador emerged from the cockpit, his presence immediately commanded respect throughout the first-class cabin. He was a seasoned pilot with over 20 years of experience, and he had dealt with difficult passengers before, but something about this particular situation felt different to him. Alice's demeanor shifted immediately when she saw the captain approaching. Gone was the angry, aggressive woman who had been terrorizing a 12-year-old boy. In her place stood a woman attempting to project charm and reasonableness, believing that she could manipulate this authority figure just as she had tried to manipulate everyone else. "Captain," Alice said with a sickeningly sweet smile, "thank you so much for coming. I'm sure we can resolve this little misunderstanding quickly. This young man is clearly in the wrong seat, and I just need you to move him back to economy, where he belongs." Captain Salvador listened to Alice's request with professional courtesy, but his experienced eyes were already taking in the full scope of the situation. He could see the young boy sitting calmly with his boarding pass, the frustrated flight attendant, and the watching passengers, many of whom were recording the entire confrontation on their phones. "I'd like to see both boarding passes again," Captain Salvador said in his authoritative but measured tone. Alice immediately produced her economy ticket with confidence, fully expecting that the captain's authority would override the obvious error that had placed her in the wrong seat. But when Captain Salvador examined Landon's boarding pass and confirmed its legitimacy, something unexpected happened. Instead of immediately resolving the situation, the captain paused and took a closer look at the young passenger sitting so composedly in seat 2A. "Son," Captain Salvador said gently, "can you tell me your full name for verification purposes?" Landon looked up at the captain with respect and spoke clearly. "Landon Mark, sir." The captain's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. There was something about that name that had caught his attention. Something that made him pause and consider possibilities that Alice Henderson couldn't even begin to imagine. "Mark?" Captain Salvador repeated, his voice carrying a new tone of interest. "Is your father Ted Mark?" Landon's face lit up with pride as he responded, "Yes, sir. That's my dad." The change in Captain Salvador's expression was subtle but unmistakable to those who were watching closely. A look of recognition, respect, and perhaps even a touch of surprise crossed his features as the full implications of the situation began to dawn on him. Alice watched this exchange with growing confusion and irritation. Why was the captain wasting time with small talk when he should be resolving her seating problem? What could possibly be important about this boy's father, and why did it matter who he was? Make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what Captain Salvador reveals next will absolutely destroy Alice Henderson's world in the most spectacular way possible. And let me ask you this. Have you ever seen someone's confidence completely backfire on them like this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Alice had no idea that her demand to speak to someone in authority was about to reveal a truth so shocking that it would transform her from the aggressor into the most humiliated person on that aircraft. And the name Ted Mark was about to become the most important piece of information in her entire miserable day. What happened next would go down in aviation history as one of the most spectacular reversals of fortune ever witnessed at 30,000 feet. Captain Salvador's demeanor had shifted completely as he processed the significance of the name he had just heard. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a tone of respect and authority that silenced the entire first-class cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Salvador announced, his voice projecting clearly throughout the aircraft, "this young man is the son of Ted Mark." He paused, letting the name hang in the air before delivering the revelation that would shatter Alice Henderson's world into a million pieces. Ted Mark is the CEO and owner of Mark Aviation Group, which owns this airline. The words hit Alice like a physical blow. The color drained from her face so quickly that she looked like she might faint right there in the aisle. Her mouth fell open as the full implications of what she had just heard began to sink into her consciousness. For several long seconds, she stood frozen in complete shock, unable to process the magnitude of her mistake. Throughout the cabin, passengers gasped audibly. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the first-class section as travelers turned to each other with expressions of amazement. Several passengers who had been recording the confrontation on their phones adjusted their angles to capture Alice's reaction to this earth-shattering news. Captain Salvador continued with authority and conviction. "This young man has every right to be in this seat, which was purchased legitimately by his family. His presence in first class is not only appropriate, but represents the very values that this airline was founded upon." Alice's stammered attempts at damage control were pathetic to witness. I didn't know. This is all just a misunderstanding," she babbled, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. Her hands shook as she realized that she had spent the last 20 minutes racially harassing the son of the man who literally owned the airline she was flying on. But Captain Salvador wasn't finished. His professional training allowed him to maintain his composure, but his words carried the weight of absolute authority as he addressed Alice's behavior directly. "Ma'am, you have spent the better part of this flight harassing the son of our company owner, making racist assumptions about his right to be here, and creating a hostile environment for other passengers." The captain's explanation of exactly what Alice had done, harassing the son of the company owner, sent another wave of shock through the cabin. Alice's desperate attempts to claim misunderstanding fell on deaf ears, as everyone present had witnessed her discriminatory behavior firsthand. Other passengers continued recording the moment, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something that would soon become viral content. Some shook their heads in disbelief at Alice's behavior, while others looked on with a mixture of satisfaction and secondhand embarrassment as justice unfolded before their eyes. For Landon, this moment was overwhelming in ways he couldn't have anticipated. Part of him felt embarrassed by the attention and the public nature of the revelation. He had never wanted special treatment because of who his father was. But another part of him felt a quiet pride, not in his family's wealth or status, but in his father's success and the values that had built their family's company. Captain Salvador concluded his intervention with a statement that would become company policy folklore. "This airline has zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind. Every passenger deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their age, race, or background." The immediate consequences for Alice Henderson were swift and humiliating. Flight crew members approached her with professional courtesy but absolute firmness, informing her that she would be escorted to her actual seat in economy class, 23C, exactly where she belonged. The walk of shame from first class to the back of the plane, past dozens of passengers who had witnessed her racist tirade, was perhaps the longest journey of Alice's entire life. But her humiliation was far from over. Captain Salvador personally informed Alice that she was banned from all future flights on the Mark Aviation Group network, which included not just this airline but several partner carriers. Her name would be added to a no-fly list that would make air travel significantly more difficult for years to come. Meanwhile, Captain Salvador offered Landon a personal apology on behalf of the airline and arranged for upgraded service throughout the remainder of his flight. The young boy graciously accepted the apology, demonstrating the same class and dignity that had impressed everyone who witnessed the confrontation. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the passenger recordings of Alice's racist meltdown and spectacular comeuppance were already being uploaded to social media platforms. Within hours, the videos had been viewed millions of times, with hashtags like Airline Karen and #InstantKarma trending worldwide. The broader impact of Alice's actions extended far beyond the confines of the aircraft. When her employer saw the viral footage of her racist behavior, they immediately terminated her employment, citing company values and public image concerns. Business partnerships that Alice had spent years building dissolved overnight as companies distanced themselves from her toxic reputation. Mark Aviation Group released a formal statement reaffirming their commitment to diversity, inclusion, and zero tolerance for discrimination. The incident became a case study in corporate crisis management and the importance of company values extending beyond profit margins. When Landon finally had the opportunity to call his father and tell him what had happened, Ted Mark's reaction was a mixture of pride and concern. Pride in his son's composure and dignity under pressure, and concern that his 12-year-old had been forced to experience such blatant racism at such a young age. Ted's response to his son became another teachable moment about handling prejudice with grace. "You showed them exactly who you are," Ted told Landon over the phone. "Not through anger or retaliation, but through your character and dignity. That's more powerful than any response you could have given." For Landon, this experience marked a turning point in his understanding of the world and his place in it. He gained newfound confidence not from his family's wealth or status, but from knowing that he could handle difficult situations with the same grace his father had taught him. The airline crew's respectful treatment for the remainder of his flight reinforced the lesson that dignity and respect should be universal, not dependent on who your parents are. Alice Henderson's story, meanwhile, became a cautionary tale that spread across social media platforms for months. Her racist assumptions and entitled behavior had cost her everything: her job, her reputation, her business relationships, and her ability to travel freely. She became a symbol of how quickly prejudice and entitlement can destroy a life in the age of viral videos and social media accountability. As Landon's plane touched down in Chicago, he looked out the window with a completely different perspective than he had when the journey began. He had left home as a nervous 12-year-old on his first solo flight. But he was arriving as a young man who understood the power of maintaining dignity in the face of adversity. The lesson that his father had taught him that morning, that how people treat you says more about them than about you, had been proven in the most dramatic way possible. Alice Henderson's treatment of Landon had indeed revealed everything about her character, and absolutely nothing negative about his. If this story amazed you as much as it amazed me, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we have more incredible stories of justice and karma coming your way. And I have to ask, what do you think would have happened if Landon's father wasn't the airline owner? Would justice have been served the same way? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs to see that karma is real, and discrimination always has consequences. This story proves that in a world where racism and entitlement still exist, sometimes justice comes in the most unexpected and satisfying ways possible.